Hey, everybody. Welcome to Breaking the News Plus on this Thursday night. We're going to go where we've gone many times before because it's important in the state of Minnesota. We're going to talk about fraud, feeding our future specifically. And I know that you may tire of these, but they are important, and what happened today is significant. To talk about it is the captain of our Feeding Our Future fraud reporting and all other fraud reporting, really, Lou Raguse. Hey, Lou, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
All right, so today, Gandhi Muhammad. Why is that person? What's the story behind him and Feeding Our Future that matters today?
So in 11 days, Gandhi Muhammad was going to stand trial, another multi-week fraud trial in federal court for the Feeding Our Future case. And instead, he changed his mind to plead guilty. Now, he comes from this family of fraudsters that I've reported extensively about over the last month or so, led by his sister, whose name is Muhammad, who, each person played a role. Ikram recruited two brothers, a sister, her mom, and her best friend, all to take part. And she worked for actual Feeding Our Future, the nonprofit, so she had kind of an inside track. But, the same pattern of things where, they had a place where they could pretend to serve meals at. They had a nonprofit that would be allowed to bill for it. They had a fake food distribution company that's putting fake invoices for it. They had all corners of the fraud scheme, all within their family. And they personally, the group of them, stole $14 million.
Wow.
Now, Gandhi, the last one remaining, his role in the whole thing, by and large, was he owned these buildings.
Okay.
And so they would claim to serve meals at his buildings, and then he would charge them rent, and that way they laundered the money through him. He took $1.4 million in rent checks that really was fraud money that he was laundering.
Okay.
And he did more beyond that, and we would have learned a lot more about that at the trial, but he pleaded guilty just to the money laundering part of it, and they agreed to drop the rest of his charges, which is normal in a plea deal. But there was one thing in his plea deal that is unique and worth talking about.
Okay, what's that? They
agreed not to prosecute him for any other cases that they're currently investigating, broadly like that. And why that's significant is he owns other companies that build Medicaid. Now, if you want to separate these two things, Feeding Our Future is this meal program fraud that the money came from the USDA during the pandemic, supposedly to feed children in need. Medicaid is all these other programs that we've been talking about recently in Minnesota, including the autism centers and the adult daycares and stuff like that. He, according to my numbers, and my numbers are not final, I'm still waiting for more from the Department of Human Services, but he's received at least $36 million in Medicaid money. We don't know how much, if any, is fraud because he's not charged with fraud.
Okay.
Clearly, he was under investigation, though.
Potential fraud.
Yes.
Okay.
And with this, at least now we know he's not going to face charges for any of that if there is indeed fraud within his Medicaid reimbursement program.
So he pleads guilty in his role in the Feeding Our Future scheme, and then he gets the part of the deal for him to plead guilty is to not really excuse the rest, but we're not going to prosecute on the rest.
Right.
Will the expectation then by the U.S. Attorney's Office be that he gives a heck of a lot of information to them, informs them on other things?
Those are the closed door negotiations that we don't know about, but I don't think that we can assume that either.
Okay.
His sister, Muhammad, who pleaded guilty a couple of weeks ago, is the only other person that's gotten the same deal so far. So she and her brother both got the same deal. They both had their hand in a had their hands in a lot of other money. They're not going to be prosecuted for that, just in order to get them to plead guilty in Feeding Our Future. And they will go to prison. Ikram, the sister, will probably get around 10 years. We'll have to see. Gandhi's going to get about 3 years.
That's it?
That's it.
And so to Minnesotans that are hearing this tonight and they say, I'm pissed. They should get more. We should prosecute for this other stuff if it's actually fraud in Medicaid. What do you think the thinking is behind the U.S. Attorney's Office in offering a plea deal here?
Well, my assumption is that they are looking at a lot of Medicaid fraud cases. This is, where we've estimated about $1 billion, and Joe Thompson put out the number possibly up to $9 billion. There's a lot of potential charges within that fraud. Hardly any of them have been charged so far. Just a small handful of housing stabilization defendants and autism program defendants that we've reported really extensively about. But I would expect dozens, with the scale that the fraud is, dozens of charges coming within the next year or two here. They haven't gotten there yet, and they're still working on these cases from Feeding Our Future. That case first started getting charged in 2022. So we're 4 years into the charges on that so far. They need to get past those so that they can devote their time and attention to the other ones. That's my impression of what's going on right now at the U.S. Attorney's Office.
So this man, Mr. Muhammad, and his sister, who you covered two weeks ago, they're going to prison. Do they have to pay any restitution?
Yes. And so I don't have all the restitution numbers in front of me, but Gandhi Muhammad will have to pay back that $1.4 million. What they end up doing is they come up with, they call it a loss amount, and that is what each individual person is personally responsible for. So if you remember, there was a story last week that was kind of controversial because the guy only got 1 year and 1 day in prison. Well, his restitution amount is like a few $100,000. He's not into the millions. So his personal loss amount is much less than like these suspects that have gotten like 18 years in prison. Well, they were responsible for like $46 million. Wow. So it's like there's a big difference. Not every, they all played a role, but not every defendant is the same. And it's the same judge who's looking at all of them, Judge Nancy Brazel, and she's determining, where they fall in the spectrum. And there's sentencing guidelines that kind of guide her, and she doesn't have to go with them per se. But she's not going to give 10 years in prison to someone who stole way less money than the next person, for example.
Yeah, because we've got this is such a huge case of fraud that you have to look at it from that spectrum outlook. So back to trying to, clear the mud of what you said. Is it your opinion then that the U.S. Attorney's Office is, I think you said it in this way, that they're trying to get past these Feeding Our Future cases so they can get to the Medicaid fraud cases?
That's what I believe.
Okay.
So there is another trial that's scheduled for June, and the U.S. Attorney's Office was really trying to delay that one because they had this April trial, the Gandhi Muhammad trial, and they said, we can't be on trial for 4 weeks and then immediately start another trial. It won't get anything done. The judge didn't exactly have sympathy for that.
Is it because of staffing,
yeah.
or are they just?
Well, yes,
reason?
That's a big part of it. Because of Joe Thompson and the rest of the fraud team that left, I'm not going to minimize, they still have really good prosecutors that are still there that are working on the fraud cases. And they are getting help from the DOJ in the form of additional investigators to go through financial auditors, for example, to the time-consuming stuff to go through bank accounts and everything. They are getting help with that. But the trial lawyers, the ones that are going to try the cases, they're just going to be in court week after week after week with no time to get down and work with a grand jury to bring charges for new stuff.
Right.
And I think there is a lot of pressure now, especially, it's an administration change. The original Feeding Our Future cases were charged under the Biden administration. Now that we're under the Trump administration, I'm sure that from DOJ, they want to start seeing charges on new fraud cases because then it's their accomplishment.
Okay, that makes sense.
And the office, these attorneys, they operate pretty nonpartisan, and we've seen some indications at the top, the U.S. attorney with a little bit of change in that. But by and large, these guys that go to the courtroom and prosecute, they're like civil servants. They're not like, I want this because I'm a Republican or a Democrat. It's not like that for those guys. So they are working very much straightforward. But when I talk about the bigger picture in the administration, they want accomplishments that reflect
They want to see
their leadership.
Conviction Medicaid fraud under our administration, under our U.S. attorney that we appointed for X amount of time in prison.
Yeah.
And so you think the case of Gandhi Muhammad taking this plea today could signal some sort of transition moment that we get to Medicaid fraud and we'll see these new kinds of prosecutions start to come?
I don't think 2 years ago we would have seen immunity being offered to any extent. I mean, to me, when I saw it with Ikram Muhammad, I started talking with attorneys and I'm like, is that a normal thing? And they're like, on background, no, it's not a normal thing. It's good lawyering on the defense. That's how they got that good negotiation. Because
the defense knows they're basically, they have so many cases they've got to get to.
They have an advantage right now. The defendants are in a better place. The remaining defendants are in a better place now than they were a year ago. They have a little more negotiation power than they did a year ago. And that's simply because these cases are so old now and there's a need to get done with them so that they can do something new.
Is there any timeline, because you referred to that too, and we feel it as the Minnesota public, not that we don't want all of these prosecuted to the full extent of the law, but that we're getting so far down the line here. It's obviously just made for TV kind of stuff that you wish they could all be prosecuted at once. But you said from the beginning, I remember, that this could last 5 years, 6 years to prosecute all these cases.
Yeah, it is. There is a statute of limitations to charge.
Okay.
And then once somebody's charged, they can ask for a speedy trial and they can, get it out there as quick as possible. But there's not a statute of limitations beyond like the speedy trial rules as far as like bringing the case to a trial, except for the older it gets, the witnesses are not as good as they were. Their memories are not as good. Maybe people pass away or move. It's you need to bring a case in somewhat of a timely fashion in order to be successful.
Right, and I'm thinking with some of these fraudsters, wouldn't they have already dipped out of Minnesota?
A lot of them have stayed.
Oh,
and
really?
So yeah, and just to mention, about the specific defendants here. So Gandhi Muhammad, we learned today in court, not only is he an American citizen, but he's a war veteran. He served for the U.S. military in the war in Iraq. And he has an MBA. And so he has all the tools to be extremely successful without having to commit fraud. So that's part of the tragedy of that case in particular. To compare to yesterday, there was a 65-year-old man who got sentenced to about 3 years in prison. Clearly played a role in he ran this ballroom, the Benedier Ballroom on Lake Street, and allowed these fake meals to be served there. Up until he was sentenced yesterday, he really didn't have any remorse. And I mean, it was pretty remarkable. Like the biggest thing he regretted, he said, was he took out a loan from the fellow fraudster. It didn't really make much sense. But then his attorney was Ryan Pasiga, who's in my opinion, one of the best attorneys. And he was trying to explain like that he's not a sophisticated guy. And he just thought that everyone was making money during the pandemic. So if everyone's doing it, he was going to be involved in it too.
Yeah, it's like looting, basically.
Yeah. And so if you are to believe that, and maybe you don't believe it, but if you are to believe it, it shows what a range there is in the mindset of these defendants. Someone like Gandhi Muhammad, super smart, totally knows what he's doing, and then this guy allegedly was, just going with the flow.
Just along for the ride.
Yeah.
Lou Raguse, we thank you for the latest on
You're
feeding
welcome.
our future. It looks like we'll go into Medicaid in the weeks and months to come. We appreciate it.
Yep.
That's all for us on Breaking the News Plus. Take care.